Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to do an art journal page with a vintage flair, and it all starts with this napkin, Heloise. It is all sorts of vintage. It's got old rose color. It has hydrangeas leaning two different ways, which gives you lots of options. I would take this, use 1/4 of it, and use that as an Instacard. But for today's project, I am going to use 3 of the hydrangea blossoms. And I am going to layer them up something like this, up this 9x12 art journal page. So now that I know basically what I'm going to start with, where I'm going, I want to create a vintage background that complements the focal image. So I grab my folder of vintage ephemera and I am going to rip up some of the papers and collage them down. So I just start ripping, looking at what I have. I've got bits and pieces. This is a great way to use up some things in your stash. I've got old music papers that are yellowed with just time. And that's really setting the color scheme. I start ripping and I start layering it up. I know that again, I'm going to put the hydrangea down the middle, so I don't really want to have anything right underneath it. That's going to compete with the focal image or distract from it. So I'm just rough fitting the different elements. I have these number stickers. I'll be coming back to those. Now I've kept most of this video in real time. Many of my subscribers want things in real time, so I try to do some videos in real time. This took about an hour all told. That includes drawing time. So right now I am gluing the collage elements, the vintage collage elements, down with the Liquitex Fluid Matte Medium. I'm layering it up. So not only is there the pattern from the script or the music notes or the lined paper or what have you that's on each of these collage papers, but when I layer one on top of the other, that adds even more texture. I'm not attempting to cover the entire page. I want some of the mixed media paper to show through, and I will be colorizing it later. I like using these odd shapes. I don't like having straight edges, so that's why you saw me ripping most of them up. Here are some numbers, and again I'm placing the numbers and then the butterfly stickers. I'm placing them where I will be able to see them. So not in anywhere that I know I'm going to put the hydrangea. Because there's no point gluing it down and then covering it completely up. Now, if I was just making a vintage background and I didn't have a focal image in mind, I would do it all over and then deal with whatever. All these stickers and a lot of this ephemera I was gifted in Happy Mail from Barbara. Thank you so much. While that's drying, I am taking off the excess plies from the 3 hydrangeas, and I'm gluing them down with the fluid matte medium onto copy paper. The napkin, the many TCW stencils that I use, and the stamp all came from NinnysNapkins.com. There is a coupon code and a link in the description box. I put a coat of the fluid matte medium underneath and then on top to seal the napkin, because I know in all likelihood I am going to colorize it and I don't want it to soak in the napkin. It goes much better if I seal it. So once this is completely dry, I will use my scissors and an X-Acto knife and fussy cut the hydrangeas out. Get rid of all the excess napkin. And there is kind of a rough idea of what it will look like. I keep putting that in because as I'm adding more elements, I want to be selective about where I put them. I want to add some pattern and I want to add some texture to the background. So first I'm going to add some pattern using this capricious stencil, TCW 124. A swirl stencil and a swirl stamp are good basics to have in your stash. You'll get a lot of use out of them because they're not specific to any particular theme. You can use them on any page. Here I am stenciling the swirls on with black acrylic paint. Off camera, I'm getting the paint on the makeup sponge, patting it off on the craft mat so that it's not a wet, completely wet, because that will seep under the stencil and make for a mess. And while I'm not looking to make it perfect, it's not a focal image that I'm stenciling, I don't want it to bleed under and make a mess. I keep turning the stencil or even flipping it so I get a different pattern of swirl. I don't want all the swirls going the same way. I want some variation because that's what's going to make the page more interesting. And I use black because I am keeping the background neutral, but I want a little bit more contrast. Now my goal here is to allow all the collage papers to show in the end, or at least parts of them. I have a tendency to obliterate them. When it comes to stenciling, slow and steady does win the race. Once that's done and I give it a dry, I'm going to move on to adding texture. And I am going to use TCW 901 geonetting. And I'm going to put the modeling paste, white modeling paste, through the stencil. Now I'm putting it on top, so this is going to push back some of the layers that are behind. It's going to knock back some of the swirls, it's going to knock back some of the collage papers. The easiest, the most successful I am at putting modeling paste is using a key card with the modeling paste. So if you struggle with modeling paste, applying modeling paste, try it with a key card and see if that doesn't help you. And when I'm putting it on all the places, I don't want it to be the exact same amount or the same area. I want to, again, build variation in. And I'm strategically placing it where the hydrangeas will not be. I don't want modeling paste underneath the hydrangeas. There's no reason for it. You're not going to see it, and it will make it a little more difficult to glue them down. Once that's dry, I'm moving to the stage of colorizing the page. Now, one of the best colors you can use for a vintage neutral background is unbleached titanium. And I'm mixing that with a little bit of white gesso, and I'm just applying it with a makeup sponge. And I'm going on the white places of the art journal page, as well as on top of the modeling paste. For the most part, I'm avoiding putting it over top of any of the collage papers. This pushes back some of the things, and so now you see a little bit of the swirl peeking through, not the whole swirl. And I love when that happens. It just makes your background all the more interesting. If you get it where you don't want it, you can grab a wet cloth and wipe it off. Now to add to the vintage, I'm adding a little bit of brown here. I don't want the background to get too dark, so I'm wiping back some of that. And then I'm adding a little bit of quinacridone magenta, mixing it with the brown and rubbing it over top, especially those textured areas, because I want to match the color in the hydrangea. So a combination of the unbleached titanium, the burnt umber, and the quinacridone magenta. And this is just, I'm just rubbing it just lightly, especially where the textured areas are, and that just brings it out. and adds that color into the background, which makes it for a very cohesive page. At the end of the video, I have some close-ups, and you will see how that texture is brought out. Vintage is very forgiving. The more grunge you have, the more imperfect it is, the more vintage it seems to be. So I'm liking how everything is coming together. But I decide that I want to use this Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous set. I think it's called Faded Type. And I'm going to use 2 of the stamps to add a little bit more interest to the background. Now at first I grab the, I believe it's sepia archival ink, this old English stamp, and it doesn't really show up as much as I wanted. So I grab the cloth and I do wipe that off, and then I switch up to the black archival ink, and that works much better for me, gives me more of what's in my head. Then there was a number stamp in that collection, and I just add a little bit of that as well. Oh, so many yummy layers. So once I have the background done, I position the hydrangeas, and then I gluing whatever is the furthest back gets glued down first. And I am using matte gel medium here, because they're glued down onto copy paper. It's a little thicker, and the gel typically works better. I'm auditing and editing the hydrangeas. Some leaves are getting cut off, some are getting put on in other places, just to make it fit the final composition. You can shorten the stem or lengthen the stem, as the case may be. I was toying with the idea of having a vase that the hydrangeas were coming out of. So you definitely could take basically the same thing and add a vase to it. Now, I want to colorize the hydrangeas. I want to make it stand out from the background. And in order to make it more of a vintage color, add brown to your color. So here I'm adding brown to the quinacridone magenta, and that is turning it kind of faded, grungy, more vintage feel. Now the bottom hydrangea I've already colorized, and you can see the difference. It's standing out a lot more. So what I'm doing is I mix the brown with the quinacridone magenta and I added water to make kind of a wash. And I'm just using the round brush and dabbing that on to all the petals and then just rubbing it in. I want the focal image to stand out. So I need to, in my mind, deepen the colors so that it does that. Otherwise, it seemed to have gotten a little bit lost. The background was a little too much like the focal image. You could do the same with watercolor or Inktense block. If you're using watercolor though, realize that that is not permanent. If you put anything wet on it, it is going to reactivate. All the shading that was there on the napkin is still coming through because I'm doing a wash and it's very translucent. So now I'm going to use Hooker's Green and I'm going to mix it with the brown again to make it more vintage, and then I'm going to add some color to the leaves. And just redefining the stems. Now I was going to shade using my angle brush around the edge of the page, and then I decide, no, I want to grab my woodless charcoal pencil and edge the page with that. That's going to give kind of a muted, faded, more vintage feel. More in keeping with the overall feel of the page. I'm always amazed at how much edging the page adds and makes the whole page come together. I love that smudged look that the woodless charcoal pencil gives us. And I'm not afraid to use it now because I know I'm not adding wet medium on top of this. I don't varnish my art journal pages. I'm just adding a little bit of detailing, a little bit of sketchy line work with the charcoal pen on the focal image. I grab a sentiment out of my Simplify Sentiment pack. All my sentiment packs are available as a digital download at NinnysNapkins.com. You can go and check them out and find the perfect sentiment pack for how you create. The greatest step towards a life of simplicity is to learn to let go. Don't overthink it. Let things go. Don't worry. And life becomes a whole lot simpler. Simplify was my 2022 word of the year. Now I grabbed my General's charcoal, and this is a white one. It came in the set, and I'm using it to add highlights to the hydrangeas. A lot of the highlights were there originally, but when I colorized with the wash, I lost some of that, and I wanted to bring it back because I thought it added so much to the hydrangeas. This really perks this up. I'm basically following what was on the napkin before. And if I don't like what happens when I put down, because it is water soluble, I could just take a wet rag or baby wipe and wipe it back and start over. So don't stress. I just keep going until I'm happy with what I see. I grabbed my black Posca pen. Now in the sentiment, this was a poor copy and it looks very faded. And I just wanted to make this a little bit bold, a little bit bolder, make it stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going over that center part of the sentiment, a life of simplicity. I'm just going over the text. I'm taking off the tape that gives me a straight edge. If I had heated it up a little bit more, I would have avoided ripping off some of the paper. I thought I was done, but then I decided that I wanted to outline the sentiment. So I am looking for my woodless charcoal. And I'm smudging it. And I'm not too worried if I smudge on the white because I don't want it to be so perfect white. Remember, this is a vintage page. You don't want anything to be pristine colors. That doesn't go with our theme. Then I decide, oh, I didn't shade around the hydrangeas. So I started with the woodless charcoal, but then I switch it up to the Stabilo All pencil, which activates more freely, and I can get some really good shading with it. I don't put all of this on video, but I do work my way around all the hydrangea blossoms. I put the lines there, then I use the round brush, apply water, kind of wick it out to give some nice shading. If it's too dark, just add more water. That'll lighten it and diffuse it a little bit. If you want more, add more. And there is the finished page. Look at that texture, those colors, all those details, all that yumminess, vintage yumminess in the background. Loving the white highlights. I hope you give a vintage page a try. Follow some of the tips that I've given. If you do, please be sure to tag me, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook. Until next time, go get creative.